Hello everyone. The good news is I am recovering from my recent eye surgery pretty well, or at least well enough to make a visuals-based video at least. Now maybe you didn't know that. I had eye surgery, but now you do. And so, while I was stuck in the blackness of my eyes, I had a lot of free time to think. And after having had some recent conversations on the various AC discords, that is Ace Combat, not Armored Core, an idea popped back into my mind. As some of you know, last year I published Part 1 in my Volt on the Electromagnetic Planet science fiction series. While working on it a bit last summer, yes, Part 2 will come out eventually, the script is done at least, I challenged myself to learn and apply a missing piece of world-building skills. Namely, coming up with fictional climates, or more broadly, how to fit climate into terrain so that, the people that fit into the climate, or aliens, can give me an idea of how to kind of populate and characterize them. It's a good complement to my speculative evolution and plate tectonics brain packages. So, over that last summer, I visually injected a huge amount of learning on how to do just that. And now, much like those other two things, I internally just sorta know how to do it. It helped me make this very sweet map of the planet that is the main setting of that story. So with that ability now just kind of in my head, Ace Combat 8 and its discussions re-emerged back up. And with it, the idea for today's video. Namely, does Strangereal's climate make sense? And even more so, what would Strangereal, that is the fictional, not Earth setting of the Ace Combat games, have its climate actually somewhat look like? Thankfully, I can answer just that. What areas make sense? What climate-wise does not? Maybe you have always wondered what a particular little piece of this place would kind of look like. How would familiar places change? I figured that other guy with the hair clips does pretty good with videos like this, so why not make a high-effort version of it myself? However, before we begin, there are a few disclaimers. Number 1. This is not a criticism of Ace Combat. Though in the past I've made pretty long vids pointing out what I felt were problems with the games, this video in its entirety isn't one. Ultimately, much like the very climate-confused, radially bonkers Bionicle Island of Maranui, the point of Ace Combat was to be a fun jet arcade game, and to that end, they wanted to use a variety of cool locations. So I am not going to act like games which, got more climate right or wrong, mean much beyond our general thought experiment to figure it out. A little while ago, some fun researchers did something broadly similar to Frank Herbert's planet Arrakis from Dune. Their goal wasn't to critique Dune or make fun of Frank Herbert for getting things wrong or fix the planet. It was just that kind of fun what if. Speaking of, they used a particular program to do just that, which leads to, where/how do you learn this? The answer is NASA's Exoplasm tool. This is the Exoplanetary Simulator, built off of NASA's Earth climate simulation programs. It's a program which, if you are not a programmer, is a pain in the butt to get working. I had to work with other people who were able to do that just to get my map going. It is not a program made for the general public. It's very finicky. It's very wonky. The simulation takes several simulated cycles, or years, to figure itself out. It can also just, quite dramatically, crash if the inputs are a little too exotic. It's an academic program, not a user-friendly program. But it gives you an impressively detailed account of a planet that you plug into it. That's where I learned most of this from, and broadly how to take a map and then intuit a climate onto it for a given topography, and so on. So that's what we're going to use today. Not exactly. Number 3, we are mostly doing this old school, like Tolkien, by hand. Critically, for our Strangereal map, we are kind of missing some of the most important data needed, just to even get started with Exoplasm, let alone get it working. The primary thing we're lacking is detailed and relatively sane topographic maps for the entire Ocean and Verusan continents, and inconsistent maps for Ania. And I only got one kind of okay one for Usea. So of our major continents, we're missing more than half the data really, if we want to get kind of a good bead on where we are topographically. Now we do have a bit to work with, which I will make use of, but we don't have a nice, clean, perfect topographic map, and that means I'm just going to have to do this a lot by hand and kind of filling in the gaps. However, we will use something that Exoplasm uses, namely Köppen climate regions. This seems like a lot. Trust me, as we go through this, you will see it's pretty intuitive. Everything builds on everything else. Now, I may make some mistakes. I'm not going to say this map is perfect, but I will also show you how it's done, and broadly how to get pretty close to where things sit in reality. So sit back, relax. Let's talk about the biggest, most important part of Ace Combat. All them places you fly over. Not the planes, though. Alright, so hopefully you have some snacks and a comfy chair or bed to be inside of. So let's get to it. First, right off the bat, we're going to bring our map up like so. Okie dokie. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to fill in this map with our new brain simulated model, and in the process, fill in each area and talk about how and what it all means, and how and why it all fits together. For the sake of simplicity, and because we have never been shown otherwise, Strangereal as we know it is thankfully just a strange, real world, as Kono said all those years ago. Meaning mostly it's just like Earth. Earth-like world diameter and circumference, as their latitudes and longitude system works pretty much just like our real ones. One atmosphere of Earth-like pressure and Earth-like composition. You know, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, argon, that's me, and trace gases, etc. Its orbit and orbital dynamics we can also broadly assume to be one-to-one. We have a moon, a sun of the same size, so Earth-like distance from the sun, we probably have 12 months of probably 24 hours, as we see in-game. And that all implies it's pretty much just, yep, Earth. There are also seasons, so Strangereal likely has a 1-to-1 to Earth 23.4 degree inclination, as it orbits around its sun, which causes seasons of temperature to sweep up and down its northern and southern hemispheres. So sorry to all you small Strangereal theory fans, while lower gravity would help explain the giant flying planes and huge buildings, as well as our pilot's ability to pull high Gs while always freaking talking, I don't think it fits. This is still all very important to punch in, even if it's pretty much just the same things, as it means bigger important stuff down the road for figuring out climate. Distance to a star, for example, and even what kind of star it is, will alter how much light and for how long a planet gets warmed, and how that makes weather is a small example. So returning to our big map, what is the first thing you notice? Now it may not be obvious, but here, if I plop our Earth over Strangereal, see what I mean? To put it simply, Strangereal has done the same error I made early on with my world building project of Volt. There's kind of a lot of land. It's also very equatorial. Now what do you mean a lot? That kind of sounds like too much. This is a very classic world building error, because obviously humans walk on land. So more land means more places for humans to be, means more setting for stories, right? However, this causes a whole domino of issues down the line, where if you actually want to simulate climate, you'll see some weird things start to pop up. Once again, it's totally understandable why Project Aces did this, because I did it as well, but we will soon see where this causes problems. Now moving on, it's time to start filling in our simulated understanding. First off, we have to mark out 3 very important lines. The first you are likely already aware of, the equator. The equator is useful as it is both the thing that divides the north and southern hemispheres, but it also shows us the Great Christmas Divide. From here, we need to mark out the next 2 most important lines, the Tropic of Cancer and of Capricorn. These show us the northern and southern limits of where the sun will still pass directly overhead at noon, during the course of a year. Now, why is this important? Because between the Tropics of Capricorn and Cancer, we get the tropics. As you can see, if I redisplay the Earth, a lot of the extra spicy hot places fall inside here. But we can't start filling in our map just yet. We need to map out a bunch more of the systems first. So to finish up the big important lines, let's quickly show where the 30 degree and 60 degree latitude divisions run. This splits the Earth into basically 6 nice layers. 2 at the tropics, 1 up, 1 down, 2 at the poles between 90 degrees north, south, and 60 degrees, and finally the middle zone between 30 and 60. Now as you can see, if I pop Earth back in again, with the Köppen climate zones, we can already see patterns emerging. Between 0 and 30, the tropics is very warm and hot, and wet. But between 90 and 60, we have the cold tundra and polar ice cap regions. However, between 30 and 60, we have our temperate zones. Now for some, this may already be enough, but hold on now, we're about to get, weather report with this sucker. The reason we start with these lines is simple. They break up how much sunlight warms each area. It's the sun which then in turn drives the important stuff which can answer our questions today. Namely, whether the weather will be wetter or better. Welcome on stage, the cells. What are these? They're essentially giant 3D corkscrew patterns of air, heat, and water. Put simply, the sun hits the ocean. The ocean warms, evaporates water, and this warm, wet air shoots up until it hits an equilibrium point. Then it spins out over the same area it warmed, only now cooling, then falling at the outer edge of its area. And wouldn't you know it, it lines up pretty much on the money with these helpful blue lines we added. The Earth and Strangereal both have 6 cells. These are big air tumblers. 2 Hadley cells at the equator, 2 temperate feral cells, and 2 polar cells. These are the main drivers of climate on Earth. And the larger planets with more atmosphere, like the gas giants such as Jupiter, have even more. It's what causes the visible banding that we see there. But these cells are 3D. So in addition to warming, going up, cooling, and going down, they also spiral across the planet's surface. This is because the world orbits underneath the atmosphere. In the process, the topography spins and churns up the cells, condensing and driving hot air up, shunting cold air down, and in addition, the day and night cycles add heat and cold to these giant wind belts. This then helps us quite a bit, because this means we also now know where wind comes from most of the time on the surface. Winds help carry clouds, clouds help carry moisture, mainly rain, as well as snow, so I hope you're starting to get the picture somewhat. In the tropics, the warm winds blow west towards the equator under the Hadleys. Then under the ferals, wind instead moves east. We finally, with the polars, once again have it blowing west. Okay, so we are almost ready. We just need 1 or 2 more things to add, and then we can start copenizing. Very relevant to Ace Combat, we gotta mention the jet stream. Now you've probably heard of these as they also fit into our big weather puzzle. What these are special areas where the tops of the Hadley, feral, and polar cells mix, creating high-speed floating rivers of air. They're not really fixed in place, because, they're made of air, but they undulate up and down as the borders of the cells shift, mixing the currents of air as the planet spins. Now because they're tied to that spin, to the Coriolis, they're always generally moving west to east. Now for the age of sailing ships, these were kind of useless, as they happen literally thousands of feet in the air. But for airplanes, this is muy bueno, as it gives them a tailwind boost when going, say, from New York to Paris, and does the opposite when you're trying to get back from Italy to Toronto. This is also why the North Atlantic airplane route map looks like this. Now thankfully for our map, guess what? They also tend to ripple around the 30 and 60 degree north lines. Another thing to quickly add in is our intertropical convergence zone and what it manifests as rain belts. These are the calms, the areas directly along the equator and tropics where converging air from the north and southwest collide, making sailing difficult. However, for our purposes though, these areas tend to be some of the wettest and rainiest. This manifests, as you can probably guess it in the name, the rain belts, where the moisture from the north and south tropics converge and just kind of gets dumped. This is the tropical area where arguably the largest amount of consistent rainfall happens on Earth. If anyone has heard of the tropics' dry and wet seasons, that's literally just the north-south undulation of the rain belt over the tropics. During the northern hemisphere's hottest months of April to September, it shifts north. During the southern hemisphere's hot months of October to March, it goes south. However, its movement isn't equal. The shape of the continents here vastly impacts the ranges in size and distribution of these rain belts, as well as the jet stream. So we will once again be coming back to these in a bit. And to keep things simple, let's cover the base of our last big amount of stuff moving. One important one, often overlooked, is oceanic currents. Yes, that's right. You are not only inside a giant wind vacuum cleaner, the oceans, which get blown by wind and warmed by the sun, also circulate in huge washing machines of currents. And because the air which carries rain and wind often comes off of the oceans, they also impact us even if we live on land. Now this one is a bit more complex. Basically, along each of our magic lines, we have multiple currents driving along. By the equator, directly along it, is a very thin, weak west-east current, but north and south of the equator of which is the very strong north and south equatorial currents. These push warm water west. From there, it will flow north and south along the coasts of continents, circulating in any large seas or bays along the west. Some of this warmed water can reach as far south as the 60-degree latitude, as in the Atlantic. It's also how Australia's southern Great Barrier Reef stays so warm. However, the strength of the current depends quite a bit on what the shape of the land is. Speaking of, the cold water equivalents also exist. Within 40 to 59-ish or so latitude, we have the strong east wind cold currents, like those which spin just below Australia, Africa, and South America. These move cold currents up along the west coast, just as the warm tropical currents do so along the east coast in opposition. These cold currents are partially what helps the Pacific kelp forests off of the United States keep alive and generally happy. After all, as strong as the sun is, the equilibrium here has to move more or less equivalent volumes of water, as it gets hot in and as it gets cold out. These can stretch all the way down to the equator, as well as depending on the shape of the land, as I mentioned before. However, above and below 60 degrees latitude, a polar cell-driven west wind current can spin water along the northern and southern polar cells' boundaries. Now there is a lot more complexity I could get into, such as jet stream oscillations, the oceanic-driven La Niña and El Niño cycles, but as you can see, the map is already pretty full now, and you're, probably kind of glazing over. So, as this is a fun thought experiment and not a doctorate paper on climate, we more or less have what we need. I will still mention a few things as we fill it in, but well, now we can actually do just that. So, the Köppen climate classification system we will be using works more or less on two main factors. A, how cold and hot does your year get in this place? And B, just how wet or dry does it get? The first letter is the broad category, such as C, or the color green generally, for temperate. Then the second letter for seasonal variation in humidity, so rain or no rain. Then the final letter for seasonal variation in temperature, so maybe you have a colder winter, a hotter summer, etc. As an example, Paris, France is C, temperate, F, no particular dry season, and B has warm summers. The groups in general are A, tropical, very, very hot, very, very wet, ranging down to savannas, which are very hot but seasonally wet. B, dry, very hot, very, very not wet, which covers deserts, both sandy and rocky, flat and low like the Sahara, and wide and elevated and dry like the American Southwest or Gobi. This also covers arid steppe. C, temperate, aka probably where a lot of people watching this would live. Seasonal climate shifts with options for dry winters, dry summers, and variations of cold winters and warm or hot summers. D, continental, which is pretty much imagine Canada or Russia. It's the home of the single largest land biome on Earth, the infinite mooseworks boreal forests, which in summer become infinite black fly factories. And last but not least, E, Happy Feet, the home of Kopaka, very cold tundra or literally the coldest ice caps. Generally pretty dry. So let's start with the easiest, E classification, and sorry if you didn't see this coming, Strangereal's Antarctic is, well, it's gonna be EF, ice cap, with the more northern edges probably falling into more of a tundra. As Strangereal's Antarctic continent strays further north in this one bit, into its southern polar jet stream, this unfortunately means yes, Strangereal's New Zealand is most definitely a frozen hellscape, but this little chunk here may be a little bit more like North Finland, perhaps. Really, the more notable shift is Wello. Strangereal's Not Greenland sits substantially further south than our real-life counterpart. This would make it easily dip below into the continental climate band, specifically DFD, making it look like a mostly treeless expanse, likely smoothed out by ice cap expansion and glacial contraction. However, Wello's south is very different. Sitting along a northern jet stream, its west coast would be a wetter, warmer temperate rainforest, or possibly England-like rolling hills depending on tree cover. Its east coast would be much cooler environ, perhaps closer to northern Japan. Far more habitable than real-life Greenland all around. While we are up here, let's talk about Anea. That's right, the home of both Estovakia and Emeria from Ace Combat 6. Now, due to Ace Combat 5's one mission and a general assumption by fans, many would automatically believe Anea to be a frozen hellscape, but much of it sits even lower than Wello. In fact, Grace Maria's given northern latitude places it around the same as Victoria, British Columbia, or Vienna, Austria. But latitude alone doesn't tell us everything. Vladivostok is further south than Grace Maria, but far colder than those other cities. This is where we need to return to all that stuff we set up before. The north of Anea is likely still tundra, going into cold steppe, becoming taiga, transitioning into boreal forests of pine, fir, and spruce. These would then give way to cold-hardened leafy trees like aspen and possibly birch, which resist winter best. Okay, but Argon, what about 6's locations? Do they broadly make sense? Well, as will become a running theme, yes and no. Generally, Anea's west coast sits squarely in front of the northern jet stream, and across from the Cascade Ocean, which means there's a lot of room to pick up warm evaporated water. So Bartolomeo Fortress and Vitose's climate actually make a lot of sense. Anea's southwest coast is starting to hit where California begins in our world, which has, fun fact, the same Mediterranean Köppen climate of CSB, temperate with a warm and dry summer. But Anea landing having a Middle Eastern desert just doesn't add up, sadly. It would be far wetter. Broadly speaking, the south of Anea with its long coast would be a lot like North America during the time of the Western Interior Seaway. Temperate wet summers fed by northern tropic jet streams, mixed with cold winters from polar jet streams and southwesterly winds. Think anything from Ontario, Canada down to perhaps Northern Virginia or Georgia. So many of the mission settings do work. Okay, but Argon, what about the Moloch Desert? That just doesn't make any sense, right? Well, that one is a bit of a neat one. Now, hot, dry desert, yeah, no, that's probably off the table. However, Anea has the Salumna Peaks mountain range stretching diagonally across its western portion. What this does make possible, combined with some elevation, is perhaps an altiplano, a desert which is cold both from its elevation and from the general dry conditions, usually mountains causing a rain shadow effect. With this, it's simply too dry for permanent shrubs or grasses to take seed and convert it into savanna or forest of any kind, even prairie. The American Southwest is a great example, which could be possible in Anea. However, its location would be far further west near the Salumna Mountains and not near Grace Maria. So broadly, Anea is actually a rather pleasant place. Its long southern coast in particular helps it a lot. Both the northern jet stream and likely warm currents flowing in from the Cascade Ocean into the Fuskum Sea would see the waters gently kind of ebb between warm and cold, and likely see both ample sea life and far more benign tropical storms occasionally coming north and impacting southern Estovakia. These same conditions combined would mean that Grace Maria would have a climate probably somewhere around that of Halifax, Nova Scotia, or maybe Sapporo, Japan. Cold, snowy, wet winters, but with the strong likelihood of a warmer, wet New York summer, with Emeria as a whole being decidedly somewhere around southern Canada in the north to the American Midwest and East Coast, but lacking the Appalachian Mountains to block warm southern weather. Now with that, we move on. Veruza, despite being one of the two larger continents, is another one we sadly lack a lot of details on. Ace Combat 8 will hopefully fill in perhaps a bit of this, but as mentioned before, the real pain in the butt here is the lack of detailed topographic maps. The ones provided in 5 only show a portion of the continent. It's a bit hard to tell how exaggerated the topography in question is. Topography doesn't have one right way to do it, and there are several different ways of showing relative height and elevation, and they are each useful in different ways for getting a sense of features. But gosh darn it, I promised you a climate map, so I'm still gonna do my darndest. So, remember way earlier when I said broadly Strangereal has too much land? Our first case of this is right now. Despite 5 mostly showing Yuktobania to be mountainous and Russian-esque with cold tundras, for its given territory it is unquestionably going to be a land of deserts and jungles. Which, hey, I guess Desert Arrow and Desert Lightning got right? They just vastly underestimated how much desert there was. Put simply, Yuktobania has no major depressions in its north to create lakes, and more disastrously, it sits right on the Tropic of Cancer. What this means is that in the north, the dominant winds blow both northwest and southwest away from it, so there is no natural rain-bound wind, really. There could still be freak storms and freak rainfalls, as those that happen in the Sahara, but nothing permanent. So yeah, Ace Combat 5's Ice Cage, it's a big no. Unless they meant bring a cage made of ice, or you will die of heat stroke. Worse yet, the subtropical jet stream, like all jet streams, will substantially weaken as it passes over the wide north. And the final nail in the coffin is that Yuktobania's northeastern coast appears to show elevation boxing off any would-be subtropical winds or storms which form along the coast. Generally, hot air from these large continental masses can drive the jet stream, but the jet stream doesn't give you much rain in exchange. Sinagrad, essentially, is more like the capital of Niger than Russia. And putting it bluntly, there kinda has to be some river or rail network or something supporting it, because otherwise it just shouldn't exist. But even if the topography supported a river, unlike, say, the Nile, there simply isn't enough rain to feed one in here anywhere anyways. The south couldn't be more different. Sitting squarely along the intertropical convergence zone, the desert of central Yuktobania gives way to probably first dry savanna, then as the rain belts overlap a vast swath of rainforest, and the savanna stretches likely from Ceres to Erusian oceans. This massive rainforest is fed from the east by the convergence zone's full force. Strong tropical storms and monsoons batter this area. 5's landing zone would be a lot like D-Day into the Amazon. What this also means is that in 5, the mission Powder Keg is absolutely correct. The area here would be a dense jungle. Yuktobania's arguably most benign and moderate climate sits along its northeastern coast, where a dry summer climate, somewhat like parts of India or southern China, would be relatively stable. However, beyond this, Veruza becomes extremely conjectural from yours truly. We really just don't know much about the other Verusian nations, and more importantly, their topography. Veruza, the country, has more climate in common with southern Brazil and northern Uruguay. So Toa, interestingly, doesn't have a perfect Earth equivalent, but sits firmly inside the tropics. That combined with its small size means rainforest and savanna being common is also very likely. Its southern coast would be fed by rain and storms from the southern tropical westerly trade winds coming off this ocean, while its north has the not Mediterranean Sea's northern tropical westerlies. What this effectively means is the north and south of the country exchange rainbelt seasons, and the overall climate would be very, very African and very wet. Its South Sea, though, is the right shape to scoop up colder polar oceanic currents, which could cause it to be much cooler, its average temperature, than its latitude suggests. In general, because Strangereal has more land in its southern hemisphere, its rain belts are going to be even more skewed, as continents are what breaks up the thermal heating of the oceans by the sun in the hot months which generate them. So Toa then sits pretty much smack dab in the middle of both. I am 100% sure Ace Combat 8 won't care about any of this though, and will probably do something different entirely. After all, Ace Combat tends to make countries in Strangereal based on IRL ones that have air forces, and Africa is unfortunately dead last in Air Force money, not counting Antarctica. The rest of Veruza then is me continuing to fill in the blanks. The not Europe area will likely also be very, very tropical. And if its topography is anything like Europe's, then its south will be rainforest, while its north is more like the east coast of Mexico. The far north is perhaps Scandinavian in geography, but distinctly Mediterranean and subtropical in climate, the far south of the continent also mirroring a kind of South America, but slightly wider. Largely, it'll probably be temperate in weather. So overall, yeah, Veruza, despite hosting a USSR analog, really has way more in common with South America and Africa than Northern and Central Asia. With that, we now move on to Osea. Osea has pretty much the same two big problems Veruza does. That being, we have an incomplete topographic map, the only real one coming from Ace Combat Zero's intro, and it's once again a highly exaggerated reference. You can see what I mean if I put it next to this one for Osea. The relative height above sea level is more pronounced in this map, as it is in the one for Veruza. So, once again, as I am the one adjusting the relative height maps a bit, I will also make sure that the continent doesn't have one omega plateau stretching from North Belka to Sabin. So right off, Red. Yes, the capital of the setting's not United States. It's barely above the equator. It's hot, like very hot. The capital is practically Malaysian in temperature and rain. In fact, most of the Southeast Osea is probably going to be one huge rainforest. It sits smack dab between the rain belts. It's also a east coast, which means it's getting slammed by the western intertropical wind patterns. Monsoons, hurricanes, whatever you want to call them, happen here. And in general, having this giant north-south-east coast means pretty much the same goes for the entire continent. Sapin, Treatea, and Wallachia are also primarily rainforest or wet tropical in their south, and Nordlands, despite its name, is wet subtropical into wet summer weather like that of mainland China. Such is life on a planet where the tropics smashes a lot of water into the east coasts. This, by the way, stretches down to Laseth and Aurelia. Now, I still haven't played Ace Combat X, but I think the setting is actually vaguely South American, in which case any jungle or subtropical tropics scenery here works because the bottom of Osea is essentially a chunk of South America from around Rio de Janeiro southwards. Returning to Eastern Osea, if we do run into the land issue again, we get pretty roughed up by it. Namely, it's the shape. It's pretty bad. Or pretty good, depending on if I were to ask you the question of, do you freaking love deserts? Like Verusia, Eastern Osea sits in the same latitude as the Middle East, so it is stuck once more with no major winds driving rain into it. It's too far north for the tropical convergence zone and by extension rain belts. The end result is from Nordlands through Central Osea, the very real possibility of a pretty massive central desert. There just isn't enough good sources of rain, and having lakes doesn't actually mean anything. While water does cool surrounding land, there are plenty of places like the Red Sea on Earth or the Dead Sea, where the desert quite literally borders an ocean, or water. Most of Belka would likely thus be desert, not rolling English hills. Ustio as well would be a mix of desert southwestern savannas and dry, tall, hot mountains. But what about Osea's Great Lakes? What about the Inland Sea? Would these help? In truth, the desert mission we play in Zero is probably dead right. These are not Great Lakes, they are Great Salt Seas. Evaporative depressions where seawater comes in and evaporates, leaving behind a high salinity remainder. The lower lakes may be close enough to savanna rivers and runoff to be less salty, but I doubt any are truly fresh water. Osea having these pretty brutal mountain ranges means even decreased in height, they're simply too thick for a lot of the rain to get through. Now the northern coast of the Ocean continent is a lot better off. While it is still in the calms, wind-wise, one big thing it has going for it is a long unbroken coastline. This area would see heavy mixing of colder polar oceanic currents and polar streams with warmer western Cascade Ocean ones. Together, this would probably generate a very foggy and more rainfall amount. It's further boosted by the fact the northern jet stream will likely dip further south here thanks to the shape of Wello, and the desert's heat, which means more warm, wet weather. Zero's 14th mission, the final overture, may look pretty much as it is, plus more rain and maybe some more trees. Now for a series focused on European climates, a lot of the time a good question would be, okay, where are they? The answer is actually Osea's northwestern far peninsula. It basically checks all the boxes for Europe. Number 1, it sits in the northern jet stream, forcing it north, which makes it warmer than Aeneas. Number 2, Mediterranean-like southern coastline of similar length. Number 3, Anatolian-style mountains and plateau inland. This becomes a desert further south, just like the Levant. Rather uniquely, though, the eastern coast is actually probably a wet continental one, not unlike Vladivostok or northeastern China or Korea. It's sort of like if you took out all of Russia and Central Asia and just glued the ends together. Moving centrally, the Bannon Sea is almost certainly a giant humidity cycle like the Congo on crack. Its hot central location probably drives a lot of evaporation. This in turn falls on the Osea's pointy arms northern coast, which then flows back into the ocean. So that windmill mission in 5 really should have been about cutting down jungle trees. Now Port St. Hewlett is actually pretty neat, because its IRL reference they used was Honolulu's port, because as you know, something Pearl Harbor. Rather interestingly, Hawaii actually has a number of microclimates because it's an island in the middle of nowhere. However, 5 is actually on the money here by accident. Honolulu is Köppen climate type AM, tropical monsoon. And yeah, that is actually super viable for our climate map as well. Sand Island is also, yes, a tropical island, so that is another checked box. And earlier, well, I lied. In addition to continent-spanning deserts, Osea also has a sea-to-sea jungle. The entire southern coast of Osea is phenomenally well-shaped to eat pretty much every single wet tropical wind that blows northwards. So both sides of Osea's long arm is just a giganto jungle zone, more or less. So with our filled-in map, what do we see? November City? Yeah, it's Brasilia. Valais Air Base? Mountains? Sure. Snow? Maybe if it's really high up there? Weirdly enough, the Futuro Canal, being likely based on the Suez, is actually spot on. It was maybe just a smidge more inland, or perhaps linked one of the lakes. Where it is now, it's probably more likely to be savanna bordering into rainforest. Belka in general honestly has more in common with Kazakhstan or Pakistan given its landlocked and surroundings, but distant connections to jungle and larger bodies of water. Sapin is more New World Latin than Old World Spain. Ustio isn't really a Balkan nation with its proximity to jungle and deserts and abundance of mountains, it's merely more of a Bolivia. And Osea is wholly unlike any real-world state. It's like a country stretching all the way from Europe down to the African Congo jungle. That then sums up Strangereal's biggest continent. So let's move on to Ace Combat's most visited one to wrap everything up. Osea, arguably the home of Ace Combat. Well, once again, they stuffed it into the equator with Ace Combat 5, so you know what that means. Oh yeah, Tango Line time! Do you love tropical rainforests? Cause that's what you are getting, baby. Tango Line all the time. But seriously, pretty much the entire southeast coast is another huge rainforest. Osea being relatively small and in the middle of the ocean, along the equator means pretty much torrential rain. Here as well, the Waiapolo Mountains down to the Schofield Plateau would make a very nice west-to-east river system viable. It would essentially turn this area into a mini Amazon, where the water would flow out to sea, evaporate, and then fall back on the forest again. This also means that Combert Harbor and Anchorhead all get some variation of either outright tropical rainforests or monsoon rainforests. So yeah, both Tango Line and the second mission of 7 having a huge jungle completely adds up, as does the ICEV's totally not Southeast Asian visuals. As to North Point, despite being described by fans as a not United Kingdom, it's climate-wise a lot more of a certain large state off the coast of China, or southern Japan, like Kyushu in terms of pretty wet temperate climate with mild winters. Kimona Island being a tropical Floridian launch pad checks out, however what we most certainly does not check out is breaking arrows and fleet destruction. The north of Osea is way too far south for permanent glacial cover at sea level. These areas become more of a Chinese mainland climate, while in the calms, wind-wise, the large bay and huge open northern ocean would allow both oceanic and atmospheric weather to pass inwards, and their relative open topography would keep the storms and rain these entail welcome to moisten things. So Jewel Box from AC2 or Port Edwards, the city specifically, would be relatively comfortable for those who like East Asian or Southeast Asian weather. One place which really doesn't live up to its name is Cape Rainy. Put simply, it's just kinda screwed over by the geography. The coast sits in an unfortunate nook between elevated areas. However, it's still got a reasonable enough coastline, so I think tropical savanna makes sense, as it would still likely get at least a few tropical storms or ocean-driven rain to keep it a bit wet at times. Really, it's not Washington State, it's kind of an upside-down India in terms of climate. Speaking of the same, more or less, this goes for Bonti. While the right spot for California-like Mediterranean conditions, it's put simply, once again, way too far south. The end result being more of Mumbai than LA. While across the bay Osea gets a good helping of rain, the upward shape of Aruja's southwestern coast is what kinda lifts its head out of the primo northern rainbelt passage. But returning to another very dead-on one, Whiskey Corridor is absolutely looking about right. Two massive diagonal mountains box in a hot elevated desert which is a cross between the Sahara's heat and the Arizonan elevation. By extension, Stonehenge's location in the general central desert add up. However, AC2's El Dorado and the Rocco Roja region is, as mentioned before, a decidedly big wet mess. It's just not dry enough. Likewise, 7 Shilajeh is way off. There is simply no Eastern Europe in Eastern Aruja. It's really just hot, wet India, hot, dry India, or mountains, also present in northern India. In fact, there isn't anywhere in Usea with a probable European climate. It's simply too far south to fit the northern jet stream and too far north for the southern one. Its most distant islands only get to around perhaps the southern United States climate-wise. So, I hope you enjoyed this fun thought experiment. Anea actually ends up the most America-Euro-ish. Veruja and Osea are both more Afro-South American. East Osea becomes the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. The northwest of Osea, we have never seen, actually gets the most Euro climate mix. And Ace Combat X doesn't have to change anything, I think. This was a fun little exploration of... What? You want it fixed? You want me to fix this? Didn't I say at the start it doesn't really matter? The devs never prioritize climate sims because that's, it's kind of world building that isn't super vital versus cool locations. Okay, yes, I know it bothers you, but you're hardly a majority of... Okay, fine. One last section. So, you want to fix Strangereal, and by fix, you mean make the locations make sense. What do you do? Well, I can tell you, but I ain't redoing the map. It takes too long. So, for Anea, nothing. Anea is actually mostly on the money and justifiable. Just move where the maps take place. Wello and a bunch of the smaller islands you can pretty much leave as they are, as it doesn't matter anyways. Antarctica is perfectly fine, unless you're a New Zealander fan of the series. Usea, well, my friend, the funny thing is, if you wanted Usea to be broadly more what we see, the answer was already in Ace Combat 4's booklet. You can keep the size, you don't have to shrink it down again, but just move it further north. For example, without redoing everything, making it, say, move about 30 degrees north. This turns Erusia's south coast into not California, but sorry to force cutscene, you're probably not getting birch trees either way. Its north coast becomes a wet jet stream, so Cape Rainy is a rainy cape again. Northern islands, not all of them perhaps, but the furthest northern ones turn into tundra and glaciers to broadly fit Fleet Destruction and Broken Arrow. Whiskey Corridor is still a desert. Rocco Roja may still be a bit too wet though. North Point becomes more of an England in its south and colder Scotland in its north. The eastern Usean coast becomes more of not America. The biggest loser from this move though is Tango Line fans, like yours truly. Usea is now kind of just awkwardly too far north for proper rainforest to form. You could get like wet temperate Asia, but not steamy jungles. Tango Line and Schopenberg just ain't south enough anymore. But that's also the easiest fix, really. Veruja has no such room to move, and Anea existing kind of tectono-blocks it from ever living up to its Russo-Slavic namesake. But the most borked is Osea by far. Osea, just put simply, is... well, it's the wrong shape entirely. To make Ared Euro Amero temperate, you would need to either drag it all the way up and shrink the north massively, so turn Belka and Eastern Osea into a Finnish cold steppe tundra. Alternatively, you could drag Ared down to the southern temperate zone where the IRL Cape Town is. This gets you a pseudo-American temperate, but the Eastern Osea of Belka over now gets shoved into middle of the lower tropics. Its south is temperate, but its northern coast is now a jungle. And South Osea freezes to death, ramming the Antarctic. Really, the only solution for fixing Osea would be to unironically break it apart. Drag Eastern Osea into the northern jet stream to Euroify everything from Belka over, giving it an actual Anglo-Germanic climate. Osea would then be moved to a very uninspired but functional North American position. Argon, you are just remaking our world at that point. Yeah, sorry, this is the downside of seeing the climate numbers like Neo. You start to realize things are not really arbitrary. Everything is interrelated, and the reason things happen is due to very big and complicated but set patterns. If you want to say, get creative though, you could absolutely have the entirety of Strangereal be temperate, or European. All you need to do is put the continents on a super-Earth several times larger. Alternatively, if small Strangereal theory were true, you could absolutely fit all those climates, from polar to tropical, into Usea, so long as Strangereal itself is now 1/3 the size of the Earth, and instead the size of Mars. But as you can probably tell, these things spiral out very easily. World building is a unforgiving suck pit in that way. So let's cap it off here instead. I had fun with this one, and hopefully you did as well, and maybe you even learned something about how this big world we live on fits together. Next time we will be getting back to the Shadow of Ava, so have a good one.